Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. Federal prosecutors in New York have accused the president of criminal violation of the federal campaign laws. They say Trump directed, that's the word, for lawyer Michael Cohen to cover up a campaign contribution in the form of payments to two women with whom he had sexual relations. This comes from the Southern District of New York, not Robert Mueller, not the so-called 17 Democrats the president says are working against him, not the deep state, not from a witch hunt. It's from one of the two sentencing memos filed in the case of Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, today, which are shedding new light on the president's potential legal exposure. As Trump's longtime fixer, Cohen pleaded guilty in August to campaign finance violations and making hush payments to two women on Trump's behalf. And now, tonight's sentencing memo makes clear that, quote, with respect to both payments, Cohen acted in coordination with and at the direction of individual one. That's the president. We're also getting new insight into what Cohen has told the special counsel in the ongoing probe of potential collusion with Russia. According to the filing from Mueller's office, Cohen not only provided information about the Moscow real estate project, Trump Tower over there, that Trump pursued during the election, but also provided information about attempts by other Russian nationals to reach the Trump campaign. According to the memo, quote, Cohen spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign, here's a phrase, political synergy, another working together, Trump and Russia against Hillary. Prosecutors say Cohen provided useful information concerning certain discrete Russia-related matters core to its investigation that he obtained by virtue of his regular contact with company executives. That was Trump company executives. That's how Cohen got the information he's been using to try to save himself. And Cohen also provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House itself after January of 2017. However, despite Cohen's assistance, prosecutors in the Southern District of New York still recommended a substantial term of imprisonment for Michael Cohen, given the nature of his crimes. Also tonight, prosecutors detailed how Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, lied to them repeatedly while he was supposedly cooperating with them. What a news night. I'm joined right now by Ken Delaney, reporter for NBC's Investigative Unit, Julia Ainsley, a national security and justice reporter for NBC News, Barbara McQuade, a former U.S. attorney out in Michigan, Mimi Rocah, former assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. I want to start with Ken. I want to focus on one thing first. I want to focus on the criminal violation of the campaign laws, this effort to cover up what is really a campaign contribution of $130,000, $150,000, adding it up to cover up these affairs with these two women. The president directed that activity, according to this memorandum today. Ken.
Yes, Chris. And in fact, you know, Michael Cohen already stood up in court and said that when he pleaded guilty to these charges in the Southern District of New York. But what's different is today is that the U.S. Attorney's Office, a representative of the United States of America, is endorsing that view in black and white in a court filing that Cohen acted in coordination with and at the direction of individual one, Donald Trump, who would become the president of the United States. Now, the reason I've been told it's not accurate to call him an unindicted co-conspirator because there still is an issue of criminal intent. The way the campaign finance law is written, prosecutors have to prove for a violation that you had an intent to violate the law. Normally you hear ignorance of the law is no excuse. In this case, ignorance of the law can be an excuse. If Donald Trump was told by a lawyer, hey, this payment is okay, it's not a violation of the campaign finance law, that would be clearly a defense. But the facts outlined here suggest a scheme, suggest people who knew what they were doing was wrong, particularly Cohen, and clearly if a president of the United States was able to be indicted, this is a case prosecutors would pursue to the last document, to the last witness, Chris.
And just to make your point, again, the prosecutors in this case in the Southern District of New York, the federal prosecutors basically nominated and confirmed by this Republican Senate, these people say that Michael Cohen had criminal intent. They said he knew the law, that he had worked in politics. He knew exactly this was a cover-up. Julia, your thoughts on that, that Cohen, directed by the individual one, the president, is accused of knowing what he was doing. Is it possible or plausible to assume that the guy who told him what he was doing didn't know it was a criminal act? The president.
Yeah, Chris. Chris, before I came out here, I saw that Individual One was the #1 trend on Twitter, at least in this region. And it's because Individual One is named in both of these sentencing memos we've seen tonight from the Southern District and from the special counsel. In the Mueller memo, Individual One is the owner of the company, the real estate company that Cohen worked for. That would be Trump Organization. That would be Donald Trump. And he is the one who, I'm reading here, would have conferred with Cohen about reaching out to the Russian government. Then when you talk about the payments to the women that Ken was just discussing, the Individual One goes on to become the president of the United States. Pretty clear that's Donald Trump. And that he also worked with him, talked to him about the payments to those women. So in a lot of ways, it cannot be underscored that these memos really aren't about Cohen. I mean, they are about Cohen, but they really point to the president in a way we haven't seen before, and point to this administration, not just the campaign, but what's going on inside the White House.
Let me go to Barbara on this because I think the language was very strong. I was really impressed by the spirit of the prosecutor's language. They talk about how people go door to door in politics. They lick envelopes. They do all the scut work of politics in an open, transparent way, because that's what the law and our whole democracy is about, is transparent politics. And this skullduggery, this middle of the night, going to that magazine, getting them to catch and kill, getting them to kill a story about these affairs, all this done purposefully and deliberately and intricately to cover it up, to make it non-transparent. They really threw the book at this. They took this campaign violation as dead criminal activity.
You know, one of the things that a prosecutor is required to do in a sentencing memorandum is describe to the judge the nature and seriousness of the offense. And here they describe this as a very serious offense. The whole purpose of campaign finance laws is to provide transparency in who's paying for things and how they're being run. And in fact, they use the word cloud, that Michael Cohen and Individual One went out of their way and took deliberate steps to cloud that transparency by making these payments to hide the truth from the public so that they could cast an informed vote. When we have a democracy, it's based on the ability of voters to cast an informed vote. And when you're hiding the truth from the American people, then democracy breaks down. That's a serious crime.
Well, while tonight's multiple court filings appear to indicate that President Trump himself could be facing new legal exposure, including implications in a federal crime, the president, or Individual One, as he's called here, responded tonight with a show of confidence. He tweeted, "This is outlandish. Totally clears the president. Thank you." Well, that's just crazy talk. Let me go to Mimi on this. You know what's interesting? How character and morality all come to play here. That, sometimes progressives play this game and sometimes conservatives play this game, and Trumpites, whatever you call them. They say personal behavior doesn't matter. It's all about whether your politics and your ideology conforms to the candidate. It doesn't matter who the person is. Here we are talking about a guy in his affairs and the way his character shows in having the affairs, and his character showing and covering up the affairs, and how he uses his lawyer to do it, and how he uses his money to do it, and now it's all about protecting its chance to hold public office. It all integrates together. That's what I find. And the prosecutors talk like that. They hit this guy morally. That's the way I read it, that document today. It wasn't some cold, secular document. It's saying this is what brings the toxicity into American politics. These affairs being paid off, women being paid off, power being used to snuff out the truth and not enlighten democracy, but to deny the truth to democracy and the voters. Your thoughts?
Absolutely, Chris. And look, this is a typical Southern District and, frankly, any U.S. Attorney Office type of document where you talk about the purpose of the laws and the spirit of the laws. And that's important, as Barb said, to explain to the judge in terms of sentencing. And Judge Pauley is a judge who will takes those laws very seriously. I think it's important to point out here that there was a phrase used in the Southern District memo about the evidence against Cohen being, quote, overwhelming, and that he didn't cooperate out of, sort of the goodness of his heart or spirit, but because he was really caught red-handed. So for Trump to say that this clears him, we don't know all of the evidence that is, quote, overwhelming against Cohen. But I'm willing to go out on a limb here right now and say that given what the Southern District has put, as Ken said, in black and white in writing about the president's actions, I'm willing to bet that there is good evidence that Trump had the requisite intent to commit this crime as well.
And I'll go out on a limb and say this is the biggest act of self-delusion since Baghdad Bob, who said they were winning the war. I want to bring in Ari Melber, who's been brilliant on this tonight. He's MSNBC's chief correspondent as well as the host of The Beat. Ari, I love the way you put it up tonight, and I thought I want to go back to a deeper question. When Trump got away for a while, for a few weeks with the Access Hollywood tape that everybody said was going to kill him, Reince Priebus was going to walk over it. Smart Republicans, decent Republicans said the smell's too terrible here to withstand and to survive. And here we have a president basically being charged by the Federal District of New York up there with basically covering up a couple affairs with money and power and doing it in a way that I can get away with this crap. This is stuff I get away with. I got this fixer lawyer here, Cohen. He does this crap for me. I got a magazine that's going to buy this crap and kill it for me. I got it all wired. I can get away with it. Just like he said in the Access Hollywood, I can get away with it. I thought it was interesting the way you talked about it tonight.
Well, you just laid it out, Chris. That attitude that was caught on tape was not just bragging about sexual assault, which itself is potentially felonious conduct. It was also, as you just put it, his belief they'll let you get away with it. Well, that's not how those people felt, because many of them spoke out. That's not how the prosecutors in New York have deemed the conduct. And they say Michael Cohen had that same mentality. If you want to call it the Trump Organization mentality, it is. We'll just get away with it. The rules don't apply. I mean, this was a 2x4 striking Michael Cohen in the head over and over today. And this is someone who went out there and did media leaks and tried to say he was doing both ways, or he was going to do this because it was for the good of the country. Or he said he wasn't taking a pardon as if this was something for him that's sitting around on a silver platter. I mean, the privilege of that. And this is the federal prosecutors, as your panel was alluding to, saying, no, it doesn't work like that. You're busted. That's why you're in trouble. You're busted. That's why you're sort of cooperating. And it still wasn't good enough, so you should do hard time. Yeah. And that comes against another thing that I think is going to roil the city you're in, the Manafort filing, which is getting attention, although it's partly redacted. Chris, it says in here on page 9, we only dealt with this briefly on my hour, Paul Manafort authorized people to speak with the administration on his behalf and then lied to Mueller about it. Paul Manafort was in contact with, quote, administration officials in 2018. Who are they? Did they lie about it? Are there other people inside the White House who are on the hook in these implicated crimes?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.